Lan Yan is the first ever Anemo shielder in Genshin, but how valuable of a role is this? I tested and calculated her in several different team comps to find out, so let's dive right in and see. The first thing to talk about with Lan Yan is her shield, as there are many unique things about it. As an Anemo unit, Lan Yan is unique in that her shield takes advantage of how Anemo can absorb elements, so her shield absorbs the first element it comes into contact with, and will be 250% more effective against that element. This makes her shield exceptionally powerful if the enemies are doing the same type of damage as it, which in particular is useful against enemies with an innate aura of the same damage type they deal, such as the Hydro Tulpa. Another unique thing about Lan Yan's shield is, it's the first ever shield to scale with attack. This is excellent because when a shield is created, it snapshots the stat that it scales with on cast for its HP. Thus, if you cast Lan Yan's shield inside Bennett's burst, it will receive a massive increase in strength from his attack buff. And the last unique thing about Lan Yan's shield is her Constellation 2. This C2 allows her shield to heal itself for a ridiculous 40% of its max HP, up to once every 2 seconds, as long as the active character hits with a normal attack. This won't create a new shield if it gets broken, but as long as the enemies do not one-shot her shield, with this C2, her shield will basically never be destroyed. To put into perspective just how strong Lan Yan's shield is, I calculated every single shield in the game. For these numbers, I am assuming that each unit has 4-piece tenacity of the Millilith buff present from someone else on the team, but do note most of them won't actually have it, making the shield 30% weaker than what is shown. For each unit, I also calculated them in two scenarios, one for building their shield as much as possible, and another for a build they are more likely to realistically have on a team. But as you can see, with Lanyan on a triple attack build holding Thrilling Tales, her shield is pretty strong even without accounting for Bennett or her Constellation 2. It's very similar to the strength of shields like Layla and Kirara on their realistic builds. Then as soon as we account for Bennett, who is used on most Lanyan teams, that jumps up to 31,000 shield HP, and then far farther beyond with her Constellation 2 accounted for as well. So overall, Lanyan has the strongest shield in the entire game. The main downside of it is that the duration is only 12.5 seconds, but that's around the same duration as most shields, with only Zhongli, Citlali, and Toma lasting longer. Now that we know just how strong Lanyan's shield is, what teams would appreciate having it? One interesting option is using her with Wanderer. I have heard other creators mention that Lanyan can use Thrilling Tales and 4-piece Scroll to buff Wanderer while shielding him, but this is not actually the way to go. What others haven't mentioned is, Lanyan has surprisingly high attack and EM multipliers on her skill and burst, and Lanyan's Constellation 1 doubles the amount of times her skill hits as long as she absorbs an element, literally doubling its damage. So at talent level 13, she's now doing over 1200% attack scaling and 1800% EM scaling on the Anemo damage, and half of that on the absorbed element, while her burst is in total doing over 1500% attack and over 2300 EM scaling. What's also really great about this is, her damage scales with all three stats that the Woodsith provides, so if using her on it, she will do great no matter which buff it gets. Thus, with these high multipliers, as well as Farazan and Bennett buffing her, if you build Lanyan well, she can dish out some really nice sub DPS damage on Wanderer's team. The caveat is she takes around 2.5 seconds of field time, so you'll either have to cast her burst before Bennett and miss out on some buffing on it, or cast Wanderer's skill as soon as you swap to him and do his charged attack inside his skill instead of before, which means he gets in a few less normal attacks. But even with that accounted for, this is still Wanderer's highest DPS shielded team. It's slightly higher than Layla, and a lot higher than Toma. While playing it in-game, I was doing more damage even with Lanyan at Constellation 1, with her burst missing 3 levels compared to my C6 Toma and Layla, so Lanyan being better than them while needing far less constellations is pretty great. Now unfortunately, Lanyan is not an overall upgrade to Wanderer as a whole, because you still get more damage using somebody like Farina instead. However, if you have Seat Lali's weapon, Starcaller's Watch, Lanyan will still do really good damage since she scales with the EM it provides, and will get a damage bonus while she's on field as well, and will then provide Wanderer with the great buff from the weapon while he's on field. This actually results in her being higher DPS than a C0 Farina for Wanderer, so if you did pick up this weapon, Lanyan will be a fantastic teammate for Wanderer. Just try to get her to at least Constellation 1, because it increases her damage by like 52% in this team, or just straight up doubles her damage if you're not using her burst. Ideally, get her to C3 to maximize her shield and skill damage, but she'll be good even at C1. Now, what about in other teams? As a support for other teams, in addition to the shield, Lan Yan's value comes from being able to buff with either Thrilling Tales or Starcrawler's Watch, while being able to shred resistance with 4-piece Viridescent. The main place I found this to be useful with is in Pyro DPS VV Vape Teams. One such DPS that can do this is Linny. One of the biggest complaints about Linny as a DPS is how punishing it is to get interrupted on him, so Lan Yan being able to provide him with such a strong shield is great, and the amount of damage he deals here still felt great. It's not quite as high as options like Shilonin, Oraran, or Kazuha for him, but it's not too far behind, and you not only get the strongest shield in the game, but you can even group when needed with Lan Yan's burst. It's only a single instance of grouping, but that will usually be all Lenny needs to get a good AoE nuke with his skill and burst. So overall, Lan Yan is the general most recommendable option for Lenny here. Yoimiya is much like Linny in that she's a Pyro Bow DPS that loses a lot of damage if she gets interrupted, so Lan Yan is greatly appreciated for her as well. Much the same as Linny, you would get more damage using Shilonin, Oraran, or Kazuha instead of Lan Yan here, but the shield may make Lan Yan better in practice for many players. Also, you can use Yelan instead of Freener here with Yoimiya if you want. The damage is slightly lower, but the Vaporize are a lot more consistent. And then there's Alakino. Alakino also greatly appreciates having a shield, since she can't be healed without using her burst. And at C0, Alakino's burst is a DPS loss, so not needing to ever cast it due to having a shield is very nice. Because of this, I actually calculate Lan Yan a bit higher than Kazuha for Alakino, although Shilonen and Oraran are still higher. Do keep in mind though, that if you aren't needing to heal with Arlecchino's burst, the DPS with the other options will be higher than Lan Yan. Another team archetype I looked into with Lan Yan is Aggravate. For Aggravate teams to use a shielder, they'll usually need to replace Nahida with a C4 or higher Kirara. Lan Yan creates an alternative where you can use her instead of Kazuha and get to keep Nahida. Using Clarand as an example DPS for Aggravate, with Lan Yan and Nahida, the result is ever so slightly more DPS in single target than Kirara and Kazuha. But in AoE, Kirara and Kazuha will be a bit higher since Kazuha will get aggravated swirls. However, Kirara requires her Constellation 4 to apply off-field Dendro, that ideally wants to be C6 so that she provides a damage bonus buff as well, whereas Lan Yan is fully functional even at Constellation 0, while being ideal at Constellation 2. Not everyone has a C4 plus Kirara, so Lan Yan being functional right out the gate at C0 makes her a fantastic alternative, and if you happen to have a C2 Nahida, then this will obviously be better than Kirara and Kazuha. Do keep in mind, however, that for Clarence specifically, her Taser and Overload teams got really big buffs with Araran and Mavrika, so those are her strongest teams now, not Aggravate. And speaking of Clarence's other teams, I did look into possibly using Lanyan over Kazuha in the Taser team with Frina and Oraran, but it's not worth it at all. Oraran and Frina, and even Kazuha's sub DPS damage plays a huge role in that team, so losing out on Kazuha's damage bonus buff, and now not having off-field swirl damage, makes the DPS drop off dramatically. So for Clarence Taser, I'd highly recommend just continuing to play it without a shield. I also looked into Lanyan as a shield option for Neuvillette. He does not benefit from Thrilling Tales, but she can still provide VV Shred for him. For a shield option, it works well for him. It's roughly equivalent DPS using Seat Lali and Kazuha, but the shield is way stronger. Lanyan's shield doesn't last the full rotation though, so if you don't have Starcrawler's Watch, you may want to consider using Lanyan on Sacrificial Fragments for a much higher shield uptime, since you can't use Thrilling Tales anyway. And those are the only teams I found Lan Yan to be worthwhile with as a shielder. One other way I looked into to use her is using herself as an on-field DPS. For this, the team would be Lan Yan, Farazan, Bennett, Farina. As mentioned earlier, Lan Yan has surprisingly high multipliers on her skill and burst, so she can front-load high damage in a team like this. The problem, however, is her normal and charged attacks; those do not have great multipliers, so her damage falls off a cliff after you cast her skill and burst. Still, it's not terrible. If you really like Lanyan and want to see her on field, with enough investment, this will be a viable way to play her. Moving on from teams, how do you build Lan Yan? As a VV support, you're naturally using her on VV, and her best weapon will usually be either Starcaller's Watch or Thrilling Tales. If you're using an Aggravate team with flexible rotations such as Kaching or Yai, Hakushan Ring is also a great option. And for her artifact stats, you'll just focus on attack percent to maximize her shield. Her burst is not important in these teams, and will usually only be used in rotations where you need grouping, so energy recharge can mostly be ignored. If you are trying to use her as an Anemo sub DPS for Wanderer or any other Anemo DPS, definitely use 4-piece Golden Troop as most of her damage comes from her skill, and then use Attack, Anemo Crit as the main stats. Her shield will be very strong even without an attack goblet or circlet, because Farazan holds Tenacity which provides a large shield strength buff, plus you have Bennett. Then for the substats, have a priority on crit and attack percent. Lanyan has high EM scaling, so EM substats are good too. And for the weapon, always use Starcrawler's Watch in this team if you have it. If you don't, I'd say just use an R5 Woodsith, as the passive is fantastic in the rotations where you get it. And then if you want to play Lanyan as an on-field DPS, assuming Farina is part of the team, which she should be, Lanyan's best weapon will be Cash Flow Supervision by far. If you don't have it, Starcrawler's Watch, Woodsith, or an R5 Solo Pearl are the best alternatives. For the sets, Meirashuse Hunter will be the best by far. 4-piece Golden Troop, Desert Pavilion, or 2-piece 2-piece options, or even 4-piece VV can be used instead, but you do really want Hunters. Main stats, attack and emo crit, with substat parity on crit and attack percent, and EM substats being okay as well. Lastly, let's talk about her constellations. The importance of each constellation varies a bit depending on the way you are using Lan Yan. If you're using her as a VV support, there's little to no point going beyond C2, C3 at most. Lan Yan does get an elemental mastery buff at C4, but it's very small, and you only get it from casting her burst, not her skill, and you don't use her burst most of the time, so this is mostly useless. Constellation 6 gives Lanyan an extra charge for skill, but this is also mostly useless as you can't cast both charges every rotation anyway due to the cooldown, and even if you could, it's not worth fitting into rotations. If you're using Lanyan as an Anemo sub DPS, her C6 can be useful as in rotations where you have both charges up, you can make her deal a lot more damage, but it will make her take even more field time and thus have a detriment on buff up times, so that second charge would just be situationally used in scenarios where you could really use the extra damage. For example, finishing off enemies that have a bit of health remaining towards the end of an Abyss Chamber without actually needing to go through a whole extra rotation. I wouldn't spend a bunch of primos trying to C6 her for this, since it will be situational. Just aim for C3, and know that you'll be fine even with C1. On the other hand, if you are trying to use Lanyan as a main DPS, you will really want to have her at Constellation 6 because it is a huge 32% increase to her damage in rotations where you have the second charge. And even averaging to account for not having it every other rotation, there's still a 16% increase, so make it a long-term goal to get it for main DPS Lanyan. That just about covers everything you need to know about Lan Yan, so what's the verdict on her place in the meta? Overall, there's a decent amount of teams that care for what she provides, those in particular being VV Vape Teams, Aggravate Teams, Wanderer, and Neuvillette. However, Lan Yan does have some flaws that are worth pointing out. Like most Anemo supports, most of Lanyan's value in a lot of her teams is heavily tied to 4-piece VV, and as we know, the resistance shred from this set can feel very impractical in multi-wave scenarios. This feels like a very outdated problem to have nowadays, when modern-day forms of resistance shred like Farazan, Deepwoods, Chevres, Seatlali, and Shilonen can easily apply their resistance shred to new waves of enemies, so it feels like Anemo as a whole needs a new modern-day support set without this outdated issue. Lanyan and Shielders as a whole would also greatly benefit if we had a buffing set for Shielders, and I mean an actually good set, not some garbage like Song of Days Past for healers. If Shielders ever got any type of really good buffing set they can use, that would allow Lanyan to be a good option in all of the teams she currently is, without having the multi-wave problems of 4-piece VV. It would also be huge for her synergy with Wanderer, since she now would be able to provide him with good buffs from her set, which she currently can't do since he doesn't benefit from 4-piece VV at all. So I do hope that in the near future we do get either a new Anemo support set, or a buffing set for shielders, or heck, even both. But yeah, that's all I have to say. If you liked today's video, please be sure to give a like and subscribe and comment your thoughts down below. Also, feel free to join my Discord where you can communicate with me and our little community directly. Thanks and goodbye.